The forest began to swallow the last light long before the suns had fully set, and the training valley dropped into that blue-gray half-shadow that always made the alien cadets restless. Bioluminescent stripes along the academy perimeter fences dimmed to a low, pulsing glow, signaling quiet hours, but no one in Camp Delta felt calm enough for sleep. Canvas shelters rustled in the faint wind, low fires crackled in carefully contained pits, and the scent of alien resins mixed with smoke hung in the air. Mason sat on a smooth rock near the edge of the clearing, turning a stick between his fingers, watching how the cadets shifted and fluttered and clicked in small clusters, each species gravitating to its own little island of familiarity. He had already learned that silence from a human unsettled most of them more than loud, confident words. For once, he did not mind being misunderstood. The day had been long, and the trial briefing had been vague in that infuriating way instructors loved. "Night defense scenario," Instructor Ral had said, frilled crest rising as he paced in front of the assembled cadets. "Unknown threat profile, limited resources, no direct intervention from staff. Your task, ensure the camp remains intact until sunrise." When one cadet had asked what kind of threat to expect, Instructor Ral had only bared his teeth in what passed for a smile among his species. "You will know it when you hear it." At the time, the line had felt theatrical, almost funny. As dusk thickened into a deeper, colder dark, the promise behind those words began to press on the clearing like invisible weight. The alien cadets moved with too much energy for the late hour. Clawed feet scuffed dirt, bioluminescent skin patterns flickered in restless pulses, delicate antennae twitched toward every snap of twig outside the circle of firelight. Mason tried not to stare, but he could not help being fascinated. On his right, a trio of glass-skinned Colorans polished their sensor helmets and whispered to one another in a chiming language that sounded like wind through crystal. On his left, a tall, furred cadet from the Acril huffed and paced, her heavy tail swaying as she muttered about pack tactics. Somewhere behind him, a slim, feathered boy from the Avex perched on top of a crate, talons hooked over the edge as he complained about the damp. Mason rolled the stick again, feeling the grittiness of bark under his thumb, feeling the familiar urge to do something practical with his hands and forcing himself to wait. Acting too soon often drew the wrong kind of attention in mixed species groups like this. He had learned that lesson in the first week. A sharp metallic chime rang from the central pole, and the chatter tapered into silence. Instructors stepped into the clearing with the unhurried confidence of beings who knew they would not be the ones tested tonight. Instructor Ral moved to the front, his purple crest unfolding in a slow, deliberate bloom that caught the dim perimeter light. Beside him, Instructor Ciela, taller, with copper-scaled skin and calm, dark eyes, held a small slate and stylus. "Camp Delta," Instructor Ral said, voice carrying easily over the ring of cadets. "You are now entering the evaluation window. From this moment until sunrise, you are considered under live trial conditions. You may request medical assistance in case of serious injury, but no direct intervention will be provided." He swept his gaze across the ring, looking briefly at each face. When his eyes passed over Mason, the human felt an odd twist in his stomach, half nerves, half anticipation. "Sensors indicate large fauna activity in the surrounding forest," Ciela added, her voice quieter but no less firm. "Do not attempt to leave the designated camp perimeter. Your objective is simple. No shelters destroyed, no cadets incapacitated." Simple, Mason thought, feeling the word lodge in his thoughts like a small stone. Simple never meant easy here. A few cadets asked more questions, probing for loopholes, but the instructors answered with the same smooth non-answers. Eventually, Instructor Ral flicked his crest flat, a sign of finality. "You have the night," he said. "Use it well." With that, the instructors withdrew to the observation ridge, a raised line of stone that overlooked the valley. Mason watched their silhouettes against the dim sky until he could not distinguish them from the jagged rocks. He knew there were drones and hidden cams scattered around, silent witnesses that would record every decision. The cadets began to talk all at once, a messy surge of speculation and bravado. Sarek, a broad-shouldered cadet whose pale plates along his arms marked him as a Tovan, stepped into the center of the clearing and raised both hands. "We know how this goes," Sarek announced, voice booming. "It is a scare trial. The instructors use sound emitters and holograms. We show coordination and courage. No one panics. We pass. There is no real danger." "You do not know that," Lyra, the acryl female, snapped. Her ears flattened against her furred skull. "The briefing said unknown threat profile. You do not ignore that phrasing." "You want to shake apart your fur every time a branch moves?" Sarek shot back. His lip plates curled in a mocking grin. "No creature on this world would be stupid enough to attack a camp full of armed cadets and watched by instructors." Mason listened as the argument escalated, words bouncing from one species to another, each cadet clinging to familiar assumptions. Some agreed with Sarek and insisted it was all simulation. Others sided with Lyra and demanded immediate fortifications. A small contingent argued for conserving energy and trusting the Academy's safety protocols. The human's fingers tightened on the stick. He thought of the briefing maps, of the highlighted hunting corridors that ringed this valley, of the footnote about native megafauna displacement recorded in prior cycles. The Academy prided itself on controlled risk, not on comfort. Fear here was never entirely fake. The first roar shattered the squabbling like a hammer through glass. It rolled over the valley in a long, low wave, beginning as a rumble too deep to be sound, and ending in a jagged, almost metallic screech that made the hairs on Mason's arms stand up. The ground seemed to vibrate under his boots. Several cadets flinched visibly. One of the glass-skinned Kalorans dropped a helmet, which bounced once on the packed dirt with a hollow clank. No one moved to pick it up. The sound came again, closer this time, echoing between the steep rock walls that framed the forest beyond the camp. It had direction now, a rough vector that pointed straight toward their clearing. Mason could hear more in it than just animal rage. There was weight behind that voice, weight and size, and a familiarity that came from hearing recordings of predatory calls in earlier lectures. The instructors had shown those clips in a brightly lit hall with safety fields humming in the walls. This was different. The night around the camp took on a new texture. Every tree beyond the perimeter fence became a potential hiding place for something massive. Every whisper of wind in the leaves turned into stealthy movement. Fires that had seemed pleasantly warm a moment ago suddenly felt too small, the circle of light they created too fragile and thin. "That is not a hologram," Lyra said, voice hoarse. Her ears had pushed forward again, tracking the sound. "Sound emitters cannot push air like that." "It could be a recording," Sarek insisted, but his tone had lost some of its earlier certainty. His eyes flickered toward the dark tree line and then up to the observation ridge. The instructors remained silhouettes, unmoving. None reached for a comm. None raised a weapon. The third roar answered the question for everyone. It was so close that the echo seemed to come from the tents themselves. Mason could feel the vibration in his chest, a heavy shove against his ribs. The fire nearest the forest guttered as if pressed down by invisible hands. Somewhere, an unseen branch snapped with a crack that sounded disturbingly like bone. Panic flowered at the edges of the group. High-voiced cadets began to speak over one another, no longer arguing theory but pushing for immediate action. "We must increase the perimeter light," someone shouted. "Flares! Use the flares!" another voice cried. "Sound emitters toward the forest line," a third added. The camp lurched into chaotic motion. Storage crates flew open, hands grabbed for equipment, and the once orderly ring of cadets devolved into knots of movement. Lyra sprinted to the light control panel and slammed a clawed hand against the override. Bioluminescent posts around the camp flared to full brightness, flooding the clearing with harsh white-blue light that made shadows razor-sharp. For a heartbeat, the brightness made Mason feel safer. Then he looked toward the forest and saw how the light failed to penetrate more than a few meters into the dense undergrowth. Beyond that thin halo, the trees remained a solid wall of black. The roar came again, irritated now, almost offended by the sudden glare. It curved around the valley, bouncing strangely off rock and foliage, making it hard to pin down the exact position of the unseen beast. The cadets assembled a row of portable sound emitters and pointed them toward the tree line. One of the Calorans tuned them to a frequency that supposedly repelled large fauna. When she activated the array, a low hum rolled out, underlaid by shrill pulses that made Mason's teeth ache. For several seconds, there was silence. Cadets held their breath and looked at one another as if victory had already been won. Mason watched the forest instead. Leaves shifted. Trunks trembled with an impact he could not see. Then the answer came. A roar so furious it cracked across the night like lightning. Something heavy slammed against the perimeter fence. The flexing of metal rang through the air, and for an instant, one section of the fence bent inward. Sparks flew where energy fields met massive bulk. Cadets nearest that side stumbled backward, some falling, some scrambling away on hands and knees. Mason rose from his rock at last, the stick still in his hand, his heart pounding. He had no intention of charging blindly toward that section of the fence, but he could not stay seated while the whole camp shook. He moved closer to the knot of cadets without pushing to the front, listening as the instructors on the ridge remained stubbornly silent. This was still the trial. No one would step in unless the camp actually breached. "The emitters enraged it!" Lyra snarled, baring sharp teeth. Her tail lashed. "Turn those things off or it will hit the fence until something fails." One of the Calorans hesitated, then dialed the power down. The painful hum faded to a whisper. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackle of fires and the rasp of frightened breathing. Mason felt the camp hold that collective breath, every eye fixed on the trembling section of fence. The unseen creature huffed once, a massive exhalation that stirred dust near the barrier. The metal posts creaked, but did not collapse. Slowly, the pressure eased. The fence shuddered back toward its original position. A murmur of relief rippled through the cadets, thin and shaky. "So it is real," Sarek said quietly, as if he needed to speak the fact aloud to accept it. His earlier bravado had drained away, leaving a more subdued, thoughtful version of the cadet. "Of course it is real," Lyra replied. Her ears flicked toward the forest again. "The Academy wants us to face something that does not care about our technology." The instructors stayed on the ridge, watching. Mason could imagine the way their recording slates filled with notes and check marks. He did not resent them for it. That was their job. His was to survive. He closed his hand around the stick until the bark dug into his palm. The night still stretched long ahead of the camp, and the roars had only just begun. The moment the fence stopped shaking, the cadets surged into nervous activity again, each group convinced that hesitation would doom the camp before dawn. The harsh light still washed the clearing in its white-blue glare, but now the brightness only made the cadets' fear more visible. Even those who tried to stand firm kept glancing toward the tree line as if the shadows might suddenly leap forward. Mason moved through the shifting clusters, listening rather than speaking, trying to understand what each cadet intended before the chaos turned dangerous. He could see that every species approached fear differently. Some tried to bury it under noise, others tried to bury it under elaborate logic. A few simply reacted without thinking at all. The first attempt to repel the beast came from the Avex cadets, who believed in overwhelming threats with sensory confusion. The feathered boy Mason had noticed earlier, a wiry student named Corin, leapt onto a crate again and snapped his wings outward in agitation. His species had evolved bright plumage and sound-based intimidation, traits he wore like armor even though his voice trembled at the edges. "We must blind it before it comes close again," Corin insisted, raising his chin with forced bravado. "Forest predators avoid light. That is universal. We only need to make the camp appear larger and brighter than the beast expects." Before anyone could object, He grabbed a flare launcher and fired it into the sky. A sphere of green fire burst overhead, spilling down shimmering trails that burned brightly for several seconds. The cadets gasped, some shielding their eyes. The forest trembled as creatures of all sizes scurried from the sudden illumination. For a brief heartbeat, Mason wondered if Corin's tactic had worked, because nothing roared and nothing struck the fence. But when the green flare faded, a deep, low rumble rolled out from the trees again, angrier than before. It was not a roar this time. It was a warning. Corin's feathers flattened instantly. The crate creaked under his talons. "Perhaps one flare is not enough," he said, voice cracking. Mason watched as two more AVEX cadets scrambled to his side with additional launchers. Before the human could speak, before anyone had the chance to evaluate the situation carefully, the three AVEX pointed their weapons at the tree line and fired simultaneously. This time the flares did not go up. They arced downward, landing in the brush only a few meters inside the forest. Fire traced small circles around the points of impact, sending long tongues of light between the trunks. Shadows stretched away from the flames like claws. At first there was no response, and several cadets began to relax. Then the forest seemed to inhale. A massive shape burst forward, still hidden behind the curtain of foliage, but close enough that Mason could feel the impact of its steps travel through the ground. The beast bellowed, a thick, violent roar filled with raw outrage. The fence bent inward again, not as severely as before, but hard enough that several cadets screamed and scrambled away. Corin stumbled backward off the crate. His wings snapped shut against his back as if he could make himself smaller by force. The light from the burning flares cast frantic shadows over the camp. "Stop shooting at the forest!" Lyra shouted. Her ears were pinned flat against her skull. "You are provoking it!" Corin opened his beak to argue, but another roar cut him off, sharper and closer. He slammed his mouth shut. Mason could see humiliation and fear war inside the cadet, but the human had no time to comfort or correct him. More groups were already rushing to try their own methods. The Tovan cadets stepped up next. Sarek, still shaken but unwilling to retreat, ordered his group to bring out the ultrasonic shriek emitters. Those devices were compact cylinders equipped with adjustable frequency nodes. In theory, they could repel creatures with sensitive hearing. In practice, Mason suspected the frequency mapping for this planet's megafauna was incomplete. Sarek held one emitter upright and tapped the tuning panel. "We use a sustained harmonic pulse," he said, willing his voice to sound steady even though his plates clicked nervously. "It will disorient the creature, perhaps even drive it away." Lyra growled under her breath, but she did not intervene. Mason understood why. Each cadet group needed to try its instinctive solutions. Otherwise, panic would turn inward. Sarek signaled his team, and 5 devices hummed to life. The sound thickened the air, a resonant vibration that punched at Mason's ears and made his vision swim. Some species winced and covered their faces. Others seemed unaffected. For a moment, the forest went quiet. No leaves rustled, no branches cracked. Even the fires seemed to shrink. Sarek lifted his chin in triumph. "It is working," he said. A heartbeat later, something slammed into the ground so hard that dust flew up in a cloud. The roar that followed shredded the harmonic pulse, drowning it completely. Several emitters sparked and sputtered as their circuits overloaded. One burst apart in a shower of blue sparks that sent 2 cadets stumbling backward. The beast rammed the fence with a furious, bone-deep impact. Metal screeched. A post snapped sideways. Mason swore under his breath and dashed forward purely on instinct to help stabilize the nearest section. Lyra was already there, bracing the buckling metal with her shoulder and snarling through clenched teeth. The creature huffed on the other side, pushing again, testing the structure. Sarek shut down the remaining emitters with shaking hands. His faceplates had turned a mottled color that Mason recognized as embarrassment in Tovan physiology. "It reacted badly to that frequency," Sarek said quietly. Lyra shot him an incredulous look. "You do not say?" But her tone lacked the sharp edge it usually held. Even she understood that frustration would solve nothing. The cadets regrouped once the beast retreated several steps into the darkness. The night had grown colder, and the fires guttered under the draft that followed the creature's retreat. The cadets' collective confidence, so loud only minutes earlier, frayed with every attempt that failed. Still, none were ready to admit defeat or humility yet. The Caloran cadets stepped forward next, carrying small vials strapped to belts of woven crystal. Each vial contained a scent compound designed to repel carnivores on several training worlds. Mason watched as one of the glass-skinned Calorans unscrewed a vial and activated it with a sharp twist. A thick plume of translucent mist drifted upward, swirling as if alive. The cadet stepped forward with deliberate poise, casting the mist toward the forest. "This is concentrated pheromone repellent," she said, her voice airy and melodic. "Predators will avoid any zone touched by this compound." Mason had doubts. Scent cues worked on Earth predators because those predators shared evolutionary behaviors. On an alien world, the signals could mean anything. The mist drifted across the ground, spreading into the first row of trees. For several seconds, nothing stirred. A few cadets began to whisper hopefully. Then a deep snort came from behind the foliage. Loud, disgusted, offended. The forest shuddered as branches snapped. The beast charged the fence again, this time not with blind fury but with deliberate force, as if punishing the camp for introducing an offensive scent into its territory. The barrier warped so hard that several metal clamps popped free. One entire panel leaned inward at a dangerous angle. Cadets shrieked and scattered in every direction. The Caloran cadet dropped the vial, which shattered into fragments that glowed faintly on the ground. Mason grabbed the leaning panel and hauled it upright again, gritting his teeth as the metal groaned. Lyra appeared at his side once more, throwing her full weight into bracing the frame. Sarek, shaken but determined, rushed forward to reattach the clamps, while Corin tried to calm several cadets who had begun hyperventilating. The beast struck the fence one last time, then retreated with a rattling growl that echoed through the valley. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. No one spoke. The flare fires in the forest sputtered out, leaving only faint smoke drifting through the trees. The bright camp lights felt too harsh now, exposing every trembling hand and every face strained with fear. Mason felt his pulse still racing, but he forced his mind to steady itself. He had watched 3 different groups try 3 complicated solutions. All had failed. Not simply failed, backfired. The cadets were smart, capable, and well-trained, but they had relied on techniques that belonged to their homeworlds, not to this one. Fear made people turn to what they knew, even when what they knew had no place here. Mason glanced at the instructors on the ridge. Neither moved. Neither offered guidance. Their silence was as deliberate as the roars. It struck Mason then, with absolute clarity, that the cadets were trapped between a dangerous creature and their own overconfidence. No one had stopped to consider practicality. No one had considered anything simple. Mason felt a thought begin to form, something grounded and sturdy, something that pressed against the panic like a hand steadying a shaking shoulder. He did not speak it aloud yet. The others needed to exhaust their desperation first. He watched the cadets regroup with frantic energy, each species ready to propose some new, elaborate method. More devices, more flares, more noise. Mason closed his fingers around the stick again, feeling its bark dig into his palm. He took a slow breath. If the cadets kept trying to frighten the beast with light and sound and chemicals, the creature would be provoked again and again until something gave way. Maybe the fence, maybe the unity of the group. Someone needed to break the pattern. Someone needed to look at the problem without fear, without pride, without tradition. Mason stepped forward, not yet to speak, but to move closer to the center of the camp. He had a plan forming, quiet and practical, and nothing about it required noise, light, or chemicals. The cadets would not like it. But if the night continued like this, Mason knew that instinct and improvisation would matter far more than technology or theory. The chaos still churned around him, but Mason felt something settle inside his chest. He was ready to act. Mason stood in the center of the camp, not raising his voice, not thrusting himself forward as a leader, but simply making himself visible. The cadets were still in frantic motion around him, each group desperate to launch the next brilliant idea before the unseen beast returned to test the fence again. Yet slowly, instinctively, a few began to notice that the human was no longer drifting at the edges of their panic. He stood with his weight balanced, his expression calm, his eyes fixed on the tree line with quiet calculation rather than fear. That contrast alone drew attention. First, Lyra glanced toward him, her fur bristling but her gaze steady. Then Sarek paused mid-argument. Even Corin, perched again on his crate, turned his crest of feathers toward Mason as if sensing a shift in the camp's center of gravity. Mason took a slow breath and stepped toward the group. He kept his movements measured. Too fast, and he risked startling someone who was already trembling. Too dramatic, and he risked looking arrogant. He needed the cadets to listen, not flinch. "We cannot keep provoking it," Mason said, voice low but shaped with enough firmness to cut through the noise. A few cadets quieted, though others continued talking over him until Lyra snapped her tail sharply against the ground. That sound, loud and crisp, made several heads jerk toward her. Mason nodded to her in silent thanks. The flares, the sound devices, and the scent compounds all made it angrier, Mason continued. The more we try to scare it, the closer it comes. The closer it comes, the more the fence bends. If we keep pushing the creature, it will eventually break through. Sarek bristled at the implication, his plates clicking sharply. Then what do you propose? We do nothing? Mason looked directly at him. We do something, but not that. Sarek opened his mouth to argue, but Mason lifted one hand. His calmness was disarming in its own way. We need a barrier, Mason said. A real one. A ripple of confusion swept through the cadets. Corin blinked slowly. We have a barrier, he said, gesturing at the trembling fence. You think wooden sticks will work where reinforced metal barely holds? Mason shook his head. Not wooden sticks. A spiked barrier. Murmurs spread again. Lyra's ears flicked forward in interest. Several Caloran cadets exchanged glances, uncertain whether Mason had lost his mind or discovered something vital. A spike wall, Mason clarified. Predators understand pain and obstruction. Light and sound confuse them, so they attack. But a physical barrier forces them to rethink. It slows them. It makes them cautious. Even big predators hesitate when faced with sharp obstacles. Pain is universal. The words hung in the air like warm breath in cold weather. The cadets gathered closer despite themselves. Mason felt the shift. Not full trust, not respect, but curiosity. He could work with curiosity. We do not have enough time to build a full wall, Sarek argued, though the stubborn edge in his voice had softened. We do not need a full wall, Mason said. Just a semicircle facing the direction the creature keeps approaching from. Enough to force it to stop. Enough to buy time. Lyra took a step forward, crossing her arms over her chest. Her eyes narrowed. We have branches and vines, she said slowly. Not solid lumber. And we cannot cut down trees. The instructors would fail us. Mason nodded. We do not need to cut trees. We use fallen branches. Anything sturdy. We sharpen what we can with knives and energy cutters. We lash the pieces together with vines. We drive the base into the soil so the spikes angle outward. It does not need to kill the creature. It only needs to make it change direction. Corin hopped down from his crate, tilting his head at Mason. And if the creature charges straight into it? Mason met his eyes. Then we make it sharp enough that it will not want to try twice. More murmurs spread. This time the tone had changed. Less skepticism, more thought. The idea was not elegant, not technological, not sophisticated enough for an interspecies academy, but it made sense. Practical sense. Survival sense. Lyra glanced at the instructors on the ridge. They watched silently, still unmoving. She exhaled slowly through her nose, her breath forming a faint mist in the cold air. "If they are allowing this," she muttered, "then it is permitted." Mason turned and scanned the tree line again. The forest was silent for now, but silence did not last long here. The creature would return. The cadets needed to move. "We need materials," Mason said. "As many fallen branches as we can find, sturdy pieces, thick roots, anything straight enough to sharpen." Sarek frowned. "You expect us to wander into the forest?" Mason shook his head immediately. "No. No one leaves the perimeter. We do not take risks. Look near the fence. The creature has stirred up the ground there. There will be debris. Use the first row of trees only. Stay in the light." Lyra nodded. "I will gather volunteers." "Not volunteers," Mason corrected gently. "Everyone. We need numbers. If we work slowly, the creature will have time to attack again before we build anything." The cadet stiffened at that. He could see the realization setting in, that this work was not optional, not leisurely, not part of a gentle simulation. It was necessity, painfully simple and painfully urgent. Lyra clapped her hands sharply. "You heard him! Move! We need materials!" The command in her voice startled several cadets into motion. The Acril often commanded respect in crisis due to pack instincts, and Lyra was no exception. She strode to the nearest section of the fence, scanned the ground, and pointed. "Branches here, roots there, gather everything." Cadets surged forward in small groups, each species moving with different rhythms, but toward the same goal. Sarek still lingered near Mason, his expression conflicted. "I do not like admitting that your idea is reasonable," he grumbled. Mason smiled faintly. "You do not have to like it. You only have to help." Sarek huffed, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. He marched toward a pile of debris and began sorting through it with surprising strength. Mason watched him for a moment before turning to find a clear space in the camp. He paced a slow circle on the ground, testing the soil with his boot, gauging where the barrier could anchor most securely. The ground near the damaged fence was soft, but not unstable. Perfect. He knelt and began to draw a rough layout in the dirt, marking the arc of the semicircle with careful lines. Corin approached him, feathers rustling nervously. "I do not understand why this will work," Corin admitted. "The creature has already rammed the fence. Why would it respect a line of sharpened wood?" Mason pressed his stick into the soil to mark another angle. "Because a fence is flat and predictable. If the creature hits it, it knows what to expect. But spikes point in different directions. Pain comes at unexpected angles. Even big predators avoid stepping on sharp things. It is instinct." Corin considered this. "On my world, predators fly." "Then this one is different," Mason said. "And that is the point. We need to think for this world, not for our home worlds." Corin's feathers loosened slightly as understanding settled in. He nodded and darted off to help gather vines. Mason continued marking the barrier's shape. He calculated spacing between spikes, anchoring points, angles of outward slant. He knew he could not engineer perfection with crude materials, but he could build something functional, something pragmatic, something that might save all of them. Soon the cadets began returning with branches, some long, some crooked, some barely usable, but enough to work with. Mason stood and gestured to the pile. "Sort them by thickness," he said. "Thick ones for base supports, medium ones for spikes, thin ones for tying braces." Lyra approached with several roots slung over her shoulder. "What about these?" "Perfect," Mason said. "Roots have natural strength. We can bend them into cross pieces." Lyra nodded approvingly and dropped them beside him. The Caloran cadets returned with bundles of vines, shimmering with faint crystal dust, even in the harsh artificial light. Mason tested one, pulling it tight. It did not break. "Good." "We start here," Mason said, pointing to the ground. 4 anchor poles, drive them deep, then slant the spikes forward." "We will need tools," Sarek said. Use knives. Energy cutters only if necessary. We do not want to draw attention with noise." The cadets fell silent for a moment. They had almost forgotten the creature in their rush to act. The forest was still quiet, but now every shadow seemed to watch them, waiting. Mason crouched beside the first anchor pole and held it upright. "Lyra, help me brace it." She planted her shoulder against the wood. Sarek raised a mallet. "Ready?" Mason nodded. "Go." The mallet struck. The pole sank into the earth. The cadets flinched, listening for a roar, but none came. Encouraged, Sarek struck again. Then another cadet took over. Then another. The first anchor pole stood firm. Mason allowed himself a small breath of relief. One piece was done. Only dozens more to go. The cadets worked faster now. Angles took shape. The semicircle rose slowly from the ground like the skeleton of a primitive creature. Vines cinched joints tight. Knives flashed. Claws and hands worked side by side. Mason supervised the spacing, adjusting when needed, tightening knots, repositioning braces, correcting angles. He felt sweat trickle down his neck despite the cold. His arms ached, his fingers burned with splinters, but he kept working. He had no idea how much time had passed. The moons shifted overhead, the fires burned low, the sky deepened into the black blue of late night. And still the barrier grew, spike by spike, beam by beam. Fear hummed around the cadets, but they were no longer frozen by it. Fear had turned into movement, into purpose, into unity. Mason stepped back to assess the structure. It was rough, primitive, ugly, but strong and sharp and real. "We are close," he said quietly. Lyra nodded. "Close enough that the creature will not like it." Mason met her gaze. "Good." As if summoned by his words, a distant branch snapped. The sound cracked through the valley like a warning shot. The beast was approaching again, slowly, purposefully. Mason felt the tremor in the ground before he heard the roar. The cadets froze for the briefest instant. Then Lyra stepped forward, eyes burning. "Back to positions," she barked. "Stay behind the barrier. Stay alert." Mason stood beside the nearly finished structure, heart pounding, muscles shaking with exhaustion, but his mind clear. The cadets gathered behind him, no longer frantic, no longer scattered. United, ready. The barrier stood between them and the forest like a line drawn in the earth, and Mason knew the creature would test that line very soon. The forest did not erupt with sound all at once. Instead, the night seemed to tighten, as if every living thing held its breath at the same moment. The air grew heavy. Even the faint glow of the camp's bioluminescent posts appeared to dim, shrinking beneath the weight of something approaching through the darkness. Mason felt the shift before he heard anything. The ground carried the tremor of slow, deliberate steps. Not the frantic charge of an enraged animal, but the measured pacing of a predator assessing its prey from just beyond the line of light. The cadets gathered behind the unfinished barrier, gripping knives, improvised tools, or nothing at all. Their breaths came shallow and shaky, yet none bolted, none scattered. The presence of the spiked wall, rough and uneven as it was, gave them a focus. Mason stood near the center of the barrier, palms resting on one of the anchor poles, steadying himself as much as the structure. Lyra lingered to his right, claws flexed. Sarek stood just behind her, shoulders squared. Corin perched on a log slightly elevated above the others, watching the tree line with wide, unblinking eyes. A branch snapped deep in the forest, louder than any before. The sound was sharp enough to echo off the valley walls. Several cadets flinched. Mason narrowed his gaze, listening for the next cue. It came almost immediately, a low, rumbling growl, so deep it seemed to resonate from the soil itself. The creature was close, very close, and no longer angry for the sake of anger. This was a stalker's growl, the sound a predator made when it was choosing where to strike. The cadets stiffened. Mason raised one hand subtly, signaling silence. No one spoke. No one dared even whisper. Another step shook the earth. Then another. A massive shadow moved behind the first row of trees, too enormous to be anything but the beast that had tormented them since dusk. The shape was vague, but the height was unmistakable. Mason felt a ripple of nausea twist through his stomach. He had known the creature was large, but seeing its silhouette dwarf the trees made his chest tighten. The cadets behind him pressed closer together. "It is testing the lights again," Lyra whispered so quietly that only Mason heard her. He gave a small nod. The creature paced just outside the reach of the harsh white-blue light, circling, trying to determine whether any new weakness had appeared in the fence or the camp. But this time, something had changed. The barrier stood in the exact place it expected to find the path clear. The beast halted. An eerie silence followed, so complete that even the crackling of the dying fires sounded too loud. Mason felt the hair on his arms lift. The creature exhaled in a slow, rolling huff, and the front line of branches swayed from the force of its breath. Then the beast stepped forward, revealing more of its bulk. Thick legs like tree trunks, shoulders that brushed the low branches above, a head broad enough to push aside saplings like grass. Its eyes glimmered faintly in the artificial light, 2 points of reflected brightness, round and sharp and full of intent. The cadets collectively tensed, but no one ran. Seeing that unity, Mason felt something fierce and steady kindle inside him. The creature took another step. Loose dirt scattered beneath its weight. The spiked barrier cast jagged shadows over its form, making the night seem filled with teeth pointing both ways. The beast grunted. Its heavy paws shifted. It lowered its head slightly, sniffing. The scent repellent from before had long faded into the forest, but the leftover traces still clung faintly to the air. The creature's lips curled in displeasure. Mason could not tell if the barrier confused it or angered it, but the moment stretched too long to be safe. A predator hesitating was a predator calculating. Mason leaned closer to the barrier's center and murmured, "Be ready." Lyra growled softly, not in fear, but in anticipation. The beast's muscles rippled. It shifted its weight back. Then, with a roar that shredded the quiet valley open, the creature charged. Cadets screamed. Mason's heartbeat thundered in his skull. The ground shook violently as the beast hurtled toward the barrier, smashing through low brush, kicking up a wave of leaves and soil. The spiked wall trembled in the rising wind of its approach. But Mason did not move back. He clenched the anchor pole until his knuckles ached. The beast slammed into the barrier with a monstrous bone-deep impact. Wood snapped, vines strained. The entire structure lurched backward, nearly toppling. Several cadets stumbled, bracing themselves against whatever they could grasp. A few cried out in pain as recoil jolted their arms. But the barrier did not fall. The spikes dug into the beast's hide, not deeply enough to pierce fat or muscle, but sharply enough to sting with raw, unexpected pain. The creature reared back with a furious bellow. It shook its head violently, slamming shoulder first into the spikes again. More wood snapped. Mason felt the entire left side of the semicircle buckle. Sarek lunged forward to brace one section with his shoulder, grimacing as splinters scraped across his plates. "Hold it!" Sarek gasped. "Hold!" Lyra threw her weight into another section, snarling. Corin leapt down from his perch and grabbed a support beam, wings flared in instinctive panic. Mason strained against the anchor pole, pushing with every ounce of strength he had. The beast struck again, and again. Each impact sent shockwaves through the ground. The spikes gouged deeper this time. The creature roared in agony and fury, stumbling back a step as blood, thick and dark, dripped onto the forest floor. The cadets gasped at the sight, not because they wanted to injure the beast, but because it meant the barrier was working. Pain forced consideration. Instinct would now battle instinct, rage against caution. The beast snarled, stomping one massive paw into the soil hard enough to create a crater. It lunged forward again, but this time it stopped short of the spikes. Its breath came in harsh, furious snorts. It paced to the right, dragging its heavy tail behind it. Mason followed the movement with tense eyes, silently praying the supporting poles on that side would hold. The creature tested the angle with its snout, pushing lightly against one slanted spike. The wood scraped its skin, causing it to flinch. It shifted to the left. More spikes angled forward. It snapped its jaws once, a sharp warning, but did not push through. "It is learning," Lyra whispered. Mason nodded. "Let it." The creature circled the barrier twice, glaring, growling, trying to find a weakness. The cadets held their breath, afraid to move, afraid to break the fragile illusion of stability the structure now created. The ground trembled again as the beast planted its front paws, lowered its head, and considered a final charge. Mason braced his entire body. Lyra crouched low, ready to counter the impact. Sarek dug his feet into the soil. But the creature did not charge. Instead, it exhaled a long, guttural rumble, one that vibrated through bones rather than ears. It lifted its head. It stepped backward. And with a final snort, it retreated into the dense forest, pushing past the trees and brush until its massive silhouette vanished completely. The cadets did not celebrate. Not yet. The night was still too dark, the danger still too near. But relief swept through the group in a trembling wave. Hands shook, shoulders sagged. A few cadets slumped to the ground, breathless. Mason stepped away from the barrier, chest heaving. His arms felt numb, and his palms were raw from gripping the wood. The barrier leaned at dangerous angles now, several spikes broken or bent. It would not withstand another full charge, but it had held when it mattered. A small sound drew Mason's attention, Corin exhaling shakily, feathers drooping. The Avex cadet looked at Mason with wide, round eyes. "It backed away," Corin whispered. "Your barrier made it stop." Mason nodded, though his own voice felt stuck somewhere deep in his throat. He swallowed and forced himself to check the structure again. The cadets gathered around, cautious but hopeful. "We need to reinforce it," Mason said finally, once he trusted his voice not to crack. "It is damaged. But dawn is coming. If we work quickly, it will hold long enough." Lyra straightened and rolled her shoulders. "Then we work." Sarek stepped forward with a tight, determined expression. "Give instructions." Mason took a breath, feeling the exhaustion gnawing at him, but the cadets watched him now not with skepticism or irritation, but with trust. The kind earned through struggle, not words. He exhaled slowly and pointed to the broken sections of the barrier. "Let us finish what we started." The cadets stepped forward together. The forest remained quiet. For now. The night was not over, but the tide had shifted, and Mason felt something new ripple through the group. Unity born from survival. The work that followed the beast's retreat felt strangely quiet, as if the valley itself had paused to watch what the cadets would do next. No one shouted anymore. No one argued. The frantic edge from earlier in the night had burned away, leaving a steady, grim determination. Mason moved along the length of the damaged barrier, marking weak points with quick taps of his fingers. The spikes that had held firm needed only minor adjustments, but several sections leaned at dangerous angles, and 2 anchor poles were cracked almost clean through. He knew that if the creature decided to test the wall again with full force, those weak spots would fail first. Lyra joined him without being asked, her breath still slightly ragged, fur dusted with dirt and stray splinters. She did not comment on the blood smeared across a few spikes, though he saw her nose twitch once as she caught the scent. She simply waited for his assessment. "We will not build more," Mason said quietly. "We will only strengthen what we have. Dawn is close. The creature will feel that. It might try one more time, or it might not bother. Either way, this wall has to hold for just a little longer." Lyra nodded. "We will make it hold." Sarek approached with a cluster of cadets behind him, shoulders squared in a way that lacked his earlier bravado, but carried something heavier and more solid. "We have more branches," he said. "Shorter ones, thicker ones, some roots, vines. Tell us where to put them. Mason pointed to one cracked anchor pole. Here first. Double the base. Brace it with 2 short supports at an angle. Then repeat that pattern wherever you see strain. Sarek relayed the instructions in a rough, commanding tone, and the cadets moved as a unit. Corin fluttered into the air and perched on the upper crosspiece of an intact section, tying reinforcement vines from above where others could not easily reach. The Caloran cadets moved with precise efficiency, weaving new lashings around old knots. The Acril cadets threw their weight into straightening slanted spikes and driving them deeper into the soil. Mason worked alongside them, hands aching, muscles burning, mind cataloging each improvement as if he could stitch the structure together with attention alone. The sky above the valley began to shift from black to deep indigo. The harsh artificial lights of the camp no longer stood alone against darkness. A faint band of pale color crept along the horizon, promising sunrise but not yet delivering it. Mason stole a quick glance toward the observation ridge. The instructors remained there, still silhouettes against the climbing light, but now he could make out more detail. Instructor Ral stood with his crest half-fanned, the posture of someone deeply focused. Instructor Saila held her slate close, stylus moving in brief, sharp strokes. Mason wondered what she was writing, but he did not dwell on it. Evaluation could wait. Survival could not. "Last section," Corin called down, voice echoing slightly in the cooling air. He tightened one final knot with his talons, then dropped lightly to the ground, wings catching his fall. "Vines are secure. No major gaps." Mason ran his hand along the nearest brace, testing tension. The barrier still looked rough and uneven, a haphazard line of sharpened wood and twisted vines. But when he pressed his weight against it, it resisted with stubborn strength. He nodded once. "Good enough," he said. "Back up. Do not crowd the wall. If it hits again, you do not want to be pressed into the spikes from behind." The cadets obeyed without complaint. They spread out in a shallow curve behind the barrier, no longer clinging to tools as weapons so much as resting their hands on them for comfort. Lyra took a position near the center, close enough to help if something buckled. Sarek stood a few steps to the left, eye ridges furrowed in concentration. Corin hopped onto a low crate just far enough from the wall that a sudden jolt would not throw him forward. Mason remained where he had been most of the night, close to the middle of the barrier, slightly ahead of the largest knot of cadets, where he could see both the forest and the structure at once. The valley quieted again. The wind shifted, carrying the cold bite of approaching dawn and the faint scent of disturbed earth. Somewhere far off, a smaller creature called out, a nervous trill that faded quickly. The beast did not answer. Minutes stretched, marked only by the crackle of dying fires and the slow strengthening of the sky's color. Tension wound through the cadets' muscles, higher with every heartbeat that passed without sound. Waiting could break a person more easily than running. Mason heard someone whisper a short, clipped prayer in a language he did not know. Another cadet quietly counted breaths. Lyra's claws kneaded the soil in small, rhythmic motions. Mason forced himself to focus on the practical details, the angle of each spike, the distance between anchor points, the depth of the posts in the ground. If his mind drifted to what might happen if the barrier failed now, panic would slip through the gaps in his control like water through fingers. The first sign of the beast's return was not a roar, but another tremor underfoot, lighter than before yet unmistakable. The cadets instinctively drew closer together, though they remembered Mason's warning and remained a few steps back from the wall. The tremor grew steadier, more rhythmic. The creature approached at a walk this time, not a full charge, as if curious rather than enraged. Mason narrowed his eyes at the tree line, watching for movement. The creature emerged moments later, more clearly visible in the dawn-gray light than at any point during the night. Massive shoulders, ridged with muscle, hide like layered bark, a head broad and heavy, crowned with bony protrusions that glinted faintly. Its eyes reflected the camp lights in a dull, unsettling shine. It carried itself differently now, not with blind fury, but with wary intent. Several cadets gasped at the sight. Corin's feathers flared, then lay flat again as he forced himself to breathe. Sarek muttered something under his breath, incredulous. Lyra's ears pinned flat, but she did not take a step back. The beast approached the barrier slowly, each step leaving deep impressions in the soil. When it reached the outer reach of the spikes, it stopped. Its nostrils flared as it sniffed, catching the mixed scents of wood, sweat, fear, and blood. It lowered its head, brought its muzzle close to one of the sharpened stakes, and exhaled. Mason watched as the spike trembled under the warm gust of air. The creature touched the wood lightly with the side of its snout. The angle of the spike pressed into its skin, not enough to puncture, but enough to sting. The beast jerked back slightly, then huffed in annoyance. It paced along the length of the barrier, head low, furious gaze sliding over the wall and the cadets beyond it. Every few steps, it nudged a spike or pressed a shoulder against a support, testing for weakness. The structure creaked, but it did not fold. The reinforcement held. The cadets held their ground as well. No one screamed. No one fired flares or switched on devices. They simply watched and waited, hands tight, but steady. Mason felt his heartbeat hammer, but he did not let it show on his face. He met the creature's gaze once when it paused near the center. For a brief second, he had the strange impression that the beast recognized something in him, not as an equal, but as a problem that required effort to solve. The creature snorted and stomped one paw, then swung its head toward the fence behind the barrier. The metal posts still bore the dents and scars from earlier impacts. It could have charged that section again, but now the spikes forced it to choose a path that put pain ahead of momentum. After a long, tense inspection, the creature stepped back. It lifted its head toward the brightening sky. The horizon had begun to glow with the first true light of dawn, a pale band that slowly ate away at the stars. The beast uttered a final frustrated rumble, then turned away from the camp. It moved along the edge of the forest, parallel to the barrier, searching for an easier route. When it found none, it pushed through a gap between trees and disappeared deeper into the woods, leaving only the fading tremor of receding footsteps. The cadets stood frozen for several heartbeats after the last sound vanished. Then, almost as one, they exhaled. Relief surged through the clearing, this time free of panic, full of something like wonder. Corin dropped to his knees on the crate, laughing weakly. Sarek sagged against a support post, plates rattling with a shaky sigh. Lyra closed her eyes for a brief moment, shoulders lowering, then opened them again and scanned the barrier with a critical gaze. "It left," Corin said, voice thin but bright. "It really left." "Because it decided the cost was not worth the effort," Mason replied. His voice sounded rough, scraped raw by hours of tension. "Predators do not take risks for no reason. We gave it a reason to go." The light strengthened, washing the camp in soft gold that made the harsh glare of the artificial posts unnecessary. One by one, the perimeter lights dimmed as the automatic cycle responded to sunrise. Warmth slid back into the air. The long night was over. On the observation ridge, Instructor Rahl finally moved. He stepped down from his vantage point with measured strides, crest folding and unfolding once. Instructor Ciela followed, slate held against her side. They approached the barrier in silence, pausing a few meters away to take in the full picture. The rough spikes, the reinforced braces, the smeared blood, the exhausted cadets standing together behind their crude creation. Rahl tilted his head slightly. "Camp Delta," he said, voice carrying effortlessly. "Trial concluded." A murmur rippled through the cadets. Some straightened, some swayed with fatigue. Mason simply remained where he stood, too tired to adjust his posture beyond basic respect. Ciela lifted her slate and consulted it briefly before speaking. "Metrics indicate sustained group cohesion after the initial panic window," she said. "Adaptive strategy adopted midway through trial. Physical barrier constructed under time pressure with minimal tools. No cadets incapacitated, no shelters destroyed. Ral's gaze settled on the damaged section of fence. "We will need repairs," he said. His crest flickered. "But that is Academy property, not part of the exam." His eyes shifted to Mason. For a moment, the noise of the camp faded to a distant hum. "Cadet Mason," Ral continued, "your proposal initiated the only tactic that reduced the creature's willingness to engage. Why did you choose a solution so primitive when you had access to advanced devices?" Mason hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because the devices were made for other worlds and other problems," he said. "The creature did not understand our technology. It only understood that something hurt and something did not. A barrier is simple. Pain is simple. I trusted that more than I trusted unfamiliar settings on unfamiliar equipment." Ral's crest lifted slightly, a subtle sign of approval. Sciela's eyes warmed with quiet satisfaction behind her calm expression. "Leadership based on observation and practicality," she said. "Not bad for a first major night trial human cadet." She turned her attention to the rest of the group. "The rest of you learned something as well. You learned that homeworld instincts can mislead you, that noise is not the same as action, and that simple does not mean weak. Remember this." Lyra's ears twitched, and she glanced at Mason with a grudging, genuine respect. Sarek shifted closer to him, no longer wary, but open in a way that felt almost like an invitation into a circle he had not been born to. Corin hopped down from his crate and came to stand at Mason's side, feathers puffed in tired pride. "I thought you were just quiet because you were nervous," Corin said under his breath. "Now I think you were quiet because you were planning." Mason let out a soft, exhausted laugh. "I was nervous and planning," he admitted. "Those things go together more often than people like to admit." The instructors dismissed the cadets, ordering rest rotations and medical checks, but no one rushed away from the barrier immediately. For a moment longer, they lingered to touch the rough spikes, to run claws or hands along the crude structure that had stood between them and something far larger than any of them alone. The wall was ugly and splintered, and already beginning to dry under the morning sun, but it felt solid in a way that would stay with them long after they left this valley. As the cadets finally drifted toward their shelters, murmuring in tired, low voices, Mason remained near the center of the barrier. He looked out at the forest, now softened by dawn light, and pictured the creature moving away through the trees to resume whatever life it had beyond this artificial test. He felt no hatred for it. The beast had done what it was born to do. He had done what he needed to do. Between those two truths, a line of sharpened wood had been enough. Lyra approached him one last time before heading to the med tent. "Next time the instructors announce a night trial," she said, "I will listen to you sooner." Mason shook his head. "Next time, you will listen to yourself sooner," he replied. "You already knew we were using the wrong tools. You just needed someone to make a different suggestion loud enough that others could hear it." Lyra considered that, then gave a small, sharp smile. "Perhaps," she said, "but I will still stand near your side when the lights go down." She walked away, tail swaying slowly. Mason watched her go, feeling a quiet warmth settle in his chest. He turned back to the barrier one more time and let his hand rest against one of the anchor poles. The wood was rough under his palm, solid and real. The night trial would pass into reports and data charts, into academy lectures and future training modules. Instructors would talk about case studies in adaptive leadership and cross-cultural tactical collaboration. That was their job. Mason's memory of the night would be simpler: a dark valley, a furious beast, and a group of frightened cadets who learned, one hard step at a time, that survival was not about who shouted the loudest or who had the most impressive device, but about who could see clearly enough to pick up what the world already offered and turn it into something that worked. The suns crested the ridge at last, spilling light over the camp and the forest beyond. Mason stepped back from the barrier and walked toward the others, exhausted but unbroken, already knowing that the next trial would come, and that when it did, he would once again trust the quiet, practical part of himself that had built a line of spikes in the dark and watched a monster decide to turn away.